There was no San Diego without the Constellation, for my entire life.
It was a story of a mass of people that helped define not only the Navy during a certain period of time, but helped define San Diego.
Constellation can hold pride of place as being San Diego's carrier.
To see it be scrapped is almost hard to comprehend.
Connie was a great ship. We were all one big family, and it was comfortable.
I'm certainly glad that she's being scrapped instead of being taken out in the ocean and sunk, as they do many.
You're seeing the dismantling of a former city. It's almost metaphorically like dismantling San Diego. You're tearing down a city, and it was a beloved city. So seeing it come to an end is just kind of a sad thing. The Constellation was ordered up in the 1950s. It was one of the first supercarriers. It was extraordinarily large. It was a conventionally powered ship, but it also came during a period of time where the Navy was also changing in Howard-powered ships. It was one of the last conventional powered ships.
The Navy was very much trying to stay in business in the face of a hostile Truman administration that was favoring drastic defense cutbacks, but favoring the Air Force because they could deliver the atomic bomb. And you wind up having a ship that would displace well over 70,000 tons with tremendous dimensions and still have the capacity to operate aircraft, which at that time were simply getting heavier and larger.
The Constellation was built in Brooklyn over a period of several years, and it was construction that went really well for a long time, but then there was a tragedy. A fire broke out in the shipyard, and it killed 50 shipyard workers. So it was a horrible, horrible tragedy, but they turned it around and were able to build the ship in a relatively short period of time after that, finish it. The Constellation was built, and it underwent sea trials in the Atlantic, but then in 1962, it made a long trip around and arrived in San Diego Bay. It would remain home-ported here for its entire career until it was decommissioned in 2003. There were periods of time when it was in other shipyards being rehabilitated, being modernized, but the ship was always officially ported here in San Diego. A carrier like the Constellation had a pretty good range, but it did have to refuel. It was not a nuclear-powered ship. It needed to take on fuel. It typically did it about every 3 or 4 days. That meant that you had to have a big oiler ship come up right beside it. You had to have the carrier here and the oiler ship here. They were a very short distance apart. You had to extend the fuel line from one to the other, and you had to maintain a steady speed so the fuel would go over easily. It was not an easy thing to do. If you went off course even a little bit, the pipeline could have come off. You could have collisions, and over the history of the Navy, those kinds of things did happen.
Burned into my memory was a near collision with the USS Mars by the USS Constellation. I was certain that we were going to collide. I was on the bridge, junior officer of the deck, conning the ship. That meant I had control of the ship. I gave the orders to the helmsman and the lee helmsman. Over me was an officer of the deck who was in overall charge as it approached a replenishment formation, of ships that gave us food and fuel and supplies and ammunition. The Constellation was approaching the oiler at about 20 knots. The replenishment formation was slowing from 20 knots to 12 knots. Unfortunately, the executive officer became distracted, and as the junior officer of the deck, I could see what was happening, and I was trying to get his attention to come left and slow down, and he waved me off. I was a 23-year-old young man, what did I know? He'd been around the waterfront years longer than I was. And at this point, the commanding officer of the ship, Captain Frederick Bardshar, came out onto the bridge, saw that we were in trouble, and said, "Who has the con?" And I shouted, "The executive officer has the con. Captain C has the con." And the captain said, "I'm the captain, I have the con. Left standard rudder, all engines stop." Unfortunately, he did that. It was too late. It was too late. If the USS Mars had not taken action and he had not taken action, the two ships would have collided at a relative speed of roughly 30 knots, and it would have been a naval disaster beyond all belief. You can imagine a replenishment group when we were initially approaching them, they were probably doing 20 knots. When we were approaching them, we were doing 20 knots. 20 knots and 20 knots, it comes up to 40 knots. The time it would have taken for us to close that distance to zero would have been less than a minute, I think. In any event, the Mars pulled out of her formation to the right, and we were going to the left, but after everything had been done by both ships to avoid the collision, we still approached to within 100 yards of the Mars, but we recovered and went alongside the oiler and were taking on fuel. I think that there were a lot of people who needed to change clothes right after that situation occurred, yes, and probably the executive officer among them.
His first major deployment would have been Vietnam and the escalating war there. There were very few down periods for that. Because it was doing so much bombing and fighting in the air, there were aircraft up and down day and night for long periods of time. So when you have that many aircraft coming in and out real fast, the likelihood of an accident spikes simply because you just have so much activity in a very confined space.
The interesting thing about the beginning of the 60s is that the Navy had gotten caught up in the missile craze. It was thought that, hey, with advances we've got now with missiles and in guidance systems, and it meant having aircraft that could carry lots of these missiles and have a dedicated radar operator, and that's how you get the F-4 Phantom. So the Navy F-4 Phantom comes out as a superlative combat aircraft in air-to-air, but without any guns. Trouble is, real life didn't handle that kind of mission in Southeast Asia. So that's a prime example of where the Navy at one point was entering the 60s thinking it was going to be facing one kind of conflict and was promptly handed something completely different.
August 28th, 1968, we launched in a pre-dawn launch, and my mission was to interdict any airplanes that were coming from the land out to the water that would be a threat to our forces. But our position was to loiter just off the coast, about 5,000 feet, and this was just near the city of Vinh, North Vietnam. Suddenly, we saw what looked like a surface-to-air missile coming off the ground. It was inland a little ways. In about 2 or 3 seconds, we realized that that wasn't a surface-to-air missile, but in fact it was an airplane that had been hit on a bombing run. So it happens that airplane came from the Constellation as well. He was really on fire. You don't normally stay with an airplane when it's on fire, but he came up on guard channel and said, "Mayday, mayday, I've been hit." So we're watching this, it seems like forever. It's only a little less than a minute probably, thinking, when is the airplane going to explode, or is he going to make it? Well, suddenly the worst fears were realized when the nose of the airplane made a steep dive and crashed right on the beach. Of course, our hearts sunk because we didn't see the ejection, and we thought he had gone in with the plane. And then suddenly we saw a parachute floating gently out to sea with an offshore breeze, which was a blessing. Navy protocol dictates that under a situation like this, where there's a search and air rescue procedure going to start, that the senior officer present is obligated to take charge. Responsibility fell to me. And I called him once he got in the water, and I said, "What's your condition? Are you all right?" He said, "I'm fine, but I'm taking ground fire." And I said, "Well, hang on, we're going to get a helo out here and we'll get you out of water as soon as possible." Of course, we didn't have any air-to-ground capability, but the natives didn't know that, so we were making high-speed passes over him just to kind of keep the other people away. As such, I had a weapons load of all missiles. I had no air-to-ground capability whatsoever. He then called me and said, "You better be careful, you're flying through an awful lot of ground fire." So I immediately adjusted our altitude up to 3,500 feet, which is 3,000 feet is about as far as small arms fire is a threat to you. And about this time, the 2A7s showed up with a full air-to-ground package. I called the pilot again in the water and I said, "Where's that ground fire coming from?" He said, "It's coming from that line of trees, which is about 50 feet up from the beach. So I told the A7 leader, I said, go in there and lay down some rocket fire to see if we can subdue that ground fire, which they did, and that helped. Unfortunately, we saw suddenly 2 natives coming out from the trees, running down to the beach, jumping into a longboat and heading out toward the downed pilot. We needed to do something very quickly with that, so I again called the A7 section leader and I said, take that boat out. So they dove in with their 20mm cannons strafing, and they just blew it right out of the water. Well, that put the kibosh on any more people coming out. Fortunately, about this time the helo showed up, and he said he was taking fire as well, but that he was going to make the rescue attempt. So he dove down toward the pilot, and when he got right over him, he pulled up sharply to stop his forward motion. He dropped his rescue line in the water with a harness. The pilot got into it, and they immediately pulled him out of the water and ran off. I can't tell you the emotional uplift to see that happen, and the fact that we could rescue him right under the nose of the enemy and get him back in safe hands. And even though it's 44 years ago, I can see it, and I can remember each of those events. I guess it'll stay with me forever.
After Vietnam occurred, the Constellation, like the rest of the fleet, became involved much more deeply in the Cold War. The Constellation was a projection of American power. The president could order the ship wherever he wanted, and you could show an incredible show of force, and that was done all over the world. The ship ended up off of Korea. It was in the Indian Ocean. It was in the Pacific Ocean. Wherever you needed to show power, you could do it by projecting the Constellation.
That was in August of 1981. President Reagan came aboard for a day. He flew out from the Western White House on a helicopter, so we had to travel up to that vicinity so the helicopter would make the shortest possible trip. It was stressful, but on the other hand, as the day got closer, there was a great sense of anticipation. We even made up blue and gold jelly bellies for him to have lunch with the crew because we knew that was his favorite candy. We had an air show. We had a sea show with some of the ships in our battle group, came alongside and did some maneuvers. And he sat out there with other dignitaries, the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet and our own battle group admiral, and of course the commanding officer of the ship. He thoroughly enjoyed himself because he'd never been aboard a Navy ship before. He was very much a sailor's man, and he did not want to just hang out with the brass. He really wanted to get with the sailors and spend some time. And then after that, he left the ship, I think it was mid-afternoon or so, got back on Marine One and flew back to the Western White House. So it was a great visit, a great day for him, a great day for us. And during the course of that visit, or as a result of that visit, the Constellation got the name of America's flagship, and that name stuck after that for the remainder of Connie's history in the Navy.
Whenever you have something said by a politician, there's always going to have to be some tagline to it. At least in the case of the Constellation, there's some substance to that.
I don't know what was going through Reagan's mind, but he was a politician, and a carrier is an instrument of foreign policy. So that was very much him saying, this is our flagship, this is a symbol of what we can do militarily. He was speaking to the crew on the ship, but he was actually speaking to the world at large, and particularly to the Soviets.
A carrier is a place you just can't take anything for granted. It could be something as simple as simply trying to climb a ladder, and you miss a rung or something, and you're landing on the hard steel.
The ship is it's a machine, and it's running continuously.
It could be something as obviously hazardous as flight deck operations. They say it's the most dangerous working environment on Earth.
When the Constellation went to the Persian Gulf, there were constant flights, and they always were with purpose. They weren't missions where days went by and nothing was really going on. It was and is a very tense place in the world where anything could go wrong at any particular time.
In April of 2003, the actual war had just started a few weeks before. We'd been in the Gulf for about 100 days at that point when we lost one of our Vikings over the side of the ship. I was actually asleep at the time, and the plane had come in at the end of the flight schedule, and it had a hydraulic failure. The aircraft is hydraulically powered, so you push on the brakes, hydraulic fluid, and there was no nose wheel steering, there was no brakes. The tail hook is gravity drop, so they release it and it drops. It was weird because the sun had just come up. It was kind of gray and rainy, and everybody was just, when emergencies happen, we know how to handle them, but no one ever thinks it happens. I had a chance to talk to a couple of the pilots. Our other planes were lined up along the landing area waiting for their opportunity to taxi and take off. And they said it was just surreal to watch the plane land and then just roll off. It was like watching a bad episode of television or something where, a crash video or something. As soon as I heard the general alarm, I jumped out of my rack and ran out and I said, whose plane? Whose plane's in the water? And they were like, oh, it's a Viking. So I threw my uniform on and ran up to my shop, got my flight deck gear, and I was out on the flight deck gear. And I mean, it was so quick from the time I heard the whistle that we had a plane in the water till the time I was on the deck. As they were going towards the edge of the ship, they're doing everything they can. They drop the tail hook. They try to, catch something to stop the boat. There were people throwing things in front of the airplane so they could try to stop it. And nothing stopped it. And they said as the nose wheel went over the side of the ship, we're gonna have to punch out of this plane. They pulled the handles, the right seater went out first and then the left seater. My master chief happened to be on that side of the ship a couple of decks down on the smoking deck. And he said he heard the explosion of the ejection seats and the plane dropped in front of him. And I would compare that to if you were sitting in a skyscraper looking out the window and somebody threw something off the roof of the building and it went by the window. But when it's your airplane and you recognize it as your airplane, he said they just ran as fast as they could, back to the maintenance department to see what was going on. An ejection seat goes about 300 feet, whether the plane's sitting on the ground or it's in the sky. And the whole idea behind that is if the plane's sitting on the ground, it's going to get high enough to allow the parachute to fully inflate. And so they were, as a plane would sit level, it was nose down a little bit, so they kind of a forward arc, but still plenty of time to get out of the plane and have their parachutes eject before they landed in the water. And obviously a water landing much softer than a land landing. You could see the air crewmen probably 300 or 400 yards off of our port side, floating in the water, the strobes going off. The helicopters were already sent out to rescue them, and they brought them aboard. As an ejection seat mechanic myself, it's one of those things where we live for that day, and you want to be there for those guys when they eject, but at the same time, you don't want them to ever have to eject. But it was, amazing. It was, so surreal, that it happened like that.
Ships always have their time, and then the time passes and it's time for another generation.
When I was on the Constellation and they flew all the jets off that day, it was really kind of sad because that's what defined the Constellation, was the air power. When all those jets left, I walked out on the flight deck and it was so quiet. Then when we went up to see her in Bremerton all those years later, just recently, the quiet was even deeper. It was eerie. It was like the echoes of the past. And in a way it was sad, not because you're celebrating war or an instrument of war, but you're remembering that 160,000 people served on this ship over a long period of time in the military to support the United States. And they had all those tales. And some of them were incredible and some of them were horrific. But it was a story of a mass of people that helped define not only the Navy during a certain period of time, but helped define San Diego, because a carrier was always here. For 40 plus years, it was part of the skyline. So when I was standing on the Connie up in Bremerton, you realized that you would never see that again, even up there. It was going to be carried away, broken down, and turned into parts for automobiles.